couple years ago, I started to see these adorable crocheted animals, or amigurumi, that others were making and sharing online, and I had to make them myself. But as I learned to make them, I noticed there were some things that I had learned over the years and some crochet tips I found online that I needed to ignore if I wanted to make these well. So in today's video, I'm going to go over some common crochet tips that I do not recommend you follow as an amigurumi beginner and what I recommend you do instead. And throughout the video, you may notice the single most important thing I recommend you do to really skyrocket your progress. So let's get started. I learned to crochet at the age of 10 making blankets with my grandmother, and she taught me to always use the hook size shown on the yarn label. And yes, this is very important when making blankets or apparel. This helps you achieve the correct gauge, which ensures your finished item is the correct size. However, using the hook size recommended on the yarn label is the first thing you need to ignore when making amigurumi, and here's why. This is Yarn Bee Velvety Smooth Hobby Lobby brand yarn, which states on the label to use a 9mm crochet hook. So I decided to make a crocheted ball using this recommended hook size. And as you can see, there are a lot of large gaps in the stitches, especially where there is an increase or decrease in stitches. And many times you will see the stuffing through these stitches. Now here is an elephant I made recently using this same yarn, but instead of using a 9mm hook, I used a 4mm crochet hook instead. This is 5 sizes smaller. And as you can see, this makes the stitches nice and snug and makes for a much nicer, cleaner looking finished project. And this is true for any yarn type, by the way. Here is another ball I made with Red Heart Super Saver medium weight yarn using a 5.5mm hook recommended. And as you can see, there are large gaps like before. And here is another ball I made using the same yarn but using a 3mm hook instead. And you can see the same result as before. There are no gaps and it is a much better finished product with the smaller crochet hook. So, lucky for you, achieving the correct gauge is not necessary when creating amigurumi. But unfortunately, there is no rule of thumb here. I can't say to always use a hook size 2 sizes smaller. Based on these examples I gave you, it could vary. So I recommend you experiment with hook sizes, and anytime you're working with a new type or brand of yarn, try different size yarn hooks to see what gives you these nice snug stitches. And maybe even make a note of it so you know what hook size you need for that specific yarn. Speaking of yarn, another tip that you might see is a beginner should start with medium or worsted weight yarn. Earlier this year, my teenage daughter told me she wanted to learn how to make amigurumi. I was thrilled. So as the tip says, she started with a medium weight yarn, and since she wanted to make amigurumi, I instructed her to use a smaller hook size. Well, she had a hard time with it. She struggled holding the yarn and holding the hook. Even when she was able to create stitches, the tension was all over the place. So I suggested she try blanket yarn instead. And after just one day of using the blanket yarn and a slightly bigger hook adequate for that yarn type, she was enjoying it. She was able to hold it well, and the yarn and hook were gliding much easier for her. So her stitch tension was much better, and she's been making tons of amigurumi ever since. Now, I know they say it's harder to see the stitches on these blanket yarns, but we have found that not to be true always. But I would be careful of a couple of things. Do not use dark yarn. With darker yarn, it is much more difficult to see the stitches. Also, some of the extra thick blanket yarns and even some fluffier chenille yarns are hard to see, especially those super fluffy yarns, so stay clear of those. My daughter used white Bernat blanket yarn and found that really easy to use. So if you've been struggling with medium or worsted weight yarn, I encourage you to experiment with a lighter colored, lower pile blanket yarn, and you may find better success. Another tip I see a lot is that a beginner should start to read and understand patterns. Well, I say don't, at least not yet. Again, when my daughter started to learn, she focused on following YouTube tutorials. It worked out great for her to see someone else doing it and walking her through the pattern row by row. After watching some videos and making some finished items, she has since begun to try out some written patterns online. She has been able to connect what she did in those video tutorials with how it looks written in a pattern. She connected that new pattern information to things she already knew, and it really sped up her learning. So I say skip the written patterns for now and simply focus on video tutorials. There are tons of free amigurumi patterns available on YouTube that are from some very talented creators. I also recommend you experiment with tutorials that you think may be too difficult for you. They may have other stitches that you haven't tried before. It really is the fastest way to speed up your learning process. The next tip I want to talk about is you can just frog your work. Frogging your work is a fun phrase we use when you undo your work or rip it out. We do this if we make a mistake or simply don't like how the project is looking. This can happen a lot when you're first learning. However, I want to encourage you to not get stuck in that perfectionist mindset when you're first learning amigurumi, especially when you make your first project. We can get stuck in this loop. You're working on your project and you don't like how it's turning out, so you frog it. So you start again and you think you know what the next row of stitches are because you just did it, but you make a mistake and have to frog it again. And then you're just flustered at this point and make another mistake, and now you just want to walk away from the whole thing. Instead, just keep going and finish it, imperfections and all. Put this project aside and make another one, and maybe even a third. I promise when you compare the third one to your first one, you're going to see an improvement. And here's a little bonus tip. When I first started, it was really difficult for me to purchase some yarn and not end up with an item that I was proud of, or an item I would even consider selling. Your first item, maybe even your first few items, are not going to be good enough to sell. So account for some of your yarn to be used solely for learning and experimenting. So, did you catch the single most important thing I recommend as you learn this new skill? Maybe you're starting this as a hobby to relax and be creative. Maybe you're working towards selling your finished amigurumi projects. Either way, so I recommend you experiment. I encourage you to experiment. I recommend you experiment solely for learning and experimenting. The more you experiment, and yes, make mistakes as you do, the quicker you will learn and you will begin to really enjoy the process. And if you stick with it, you will make amazing things. If you made it to the end of this video, I would love it if you said hello in the comments below. I'll see you guys there, and I'll see you in the next one.